All right, so this training is going to be on commitments. It's almost like the one from last week, except we shouldn't have any disruptions on the recording. So we're going to go over what a commitment is, how it's created, how it's released, how formatting transactions affects them, and the different ports people can use to look up any open encumbrances, that kind of stuff, to see what they need to close or pay at the end of the year. So here's the definitions of a commitment or obligation or encumbrance, depending on what type of document we're looking at, of what they are. So like the Title II grants and agreement, an obligation means orders placed for property, services, contracts, and subawards made in similar transactions during a period that require payment during the same or future period. In other words, we're using it to obligate a portion of our budget to make sure we don't spend more than we've been allowed to spend in budget. And so when we create a commitment, we're doing it through one of these types of transactions: standard purchase requisition, contract service requisition, an indirect cost voucher requisition, a travel rec, or a confirmed vendor amount, which is whenever we do a travel rec with the vendor payments. So anytime we get any of these things approved, not just submitting them, fully approved, a commitment or encumbrance is created. So here's a sample from a travel request from last year. We have our travel request. Someone was traveling on 7/21, coming back on 7/25. And they have a 4-line travel request. Line 1 is for motel, 2 for tax, 3 per diem, 4 for travel, and then the total amount of what they're requesting. So based on this commitment or this travel request, the commitment card gets created when it's approved. And when the general ledger entries post, debits our expenses and credits an account called encumbrance control. And so here's the journal entry itself. A bunch of arrows all over. But before I get to the arrows, I want to show you this part's down here. One line of entry to hit the expense account for each line on the request. So it's not all one subtotal, it's each line for itself. We can see the book up here is encumbrances. There's a link here that would take you to the travel request. If you were looking at the journal entry, this goes to the travel request. The posting date is 7/15. So when we prepared the travel rec, we dated it for 7/15. And the date that it was last approved, which is Scott, was 7/18. So even though it was approved on 7/18, the posting didn't actually happen on that day. It happened on the date the document was created. So depending on how long we have our proposals out there for our travel request or purchase requisitions, the encumbrance doesn't post when it's approved. It approves after it's approved, but to the date the document's dated for. And so on the journal entry, here's each of those lines. And then the secondary line for the encumbrance control hit that we talked about on this slide for debiting the expense and crediting encumbrance control. Here's what it would look like on a general ledger report. Most users aren't going to see the journal entry, they're going to see the general ledger report. So we can see the credit amounts and the encumbrance control. Again, each of them have their own separate line, not one total, not one transaction. And there's the request being debited to the travel account line item to show as an encumbrance sitting out there on this program's balances. So that's what we typically see. This is a look behind how commitments work. And so in Intacct, we have a special application that manages our commitments. In our request, we had 4 separate lines. So we have 4 separate lines being created. This is important based on how we reconcile and pay vouchers and down the road. And we'll get to that in a minute. But we can see travel request. Here's the document number, the day the commitment was created, the item ID, the amount, and this one is reconciled, so it has the released amount, how much of it is remaining, and the release card that it's tied to. So we can actually see the travel reconciliation number whenever we look here. And it does that for all 4 lines. So when we look at encumbrances and we are going to reconcile, if we create a document with 4 lines, that last document that's paying this thing, reconciling it, closing a PO, better have the same 4 lines in it, because this is going to be looking for the pairs that match with it in the next document. And so here's how we release those documents. We're going to do it through a voucher, justification, a travel reconciliation, canceling a trip, or closing a purchase order. And something to keep in mind, especially on the vouchers, justifications, and travel rec, is submitting our document does not mean we're done or the entries take place. The voucher would have to be fully approved for the commitment to be released. Or the justification, if we converted a purchase order, would have to be fully approved before the commitment is released. So if we just submit a voucher, we shouldn't expect that to be clear from our budget yet until Lynette gives the final approval. So here's the reconciliation that matches that document. This is a good example that we're using throughout because it was done properly the whole time. So they've reconciled, they have their motel tax, the per diem and mileage travel, which is just like their request. Even though the amounts changed, the amounts don't have to be the same. What we're expecting to see is that the item IDs stay the same, and in like cases of purchase orders, like the quantities are being fully exhausted. So the amounts are less, but we've kept the 4 lines, we've kept the same item IDs. And as we've seen on the commitment create card, it's been fully released the way it's supposed to because this thing was formatted correctly. And so here's the side-by-side of the request and the reconciliation. Everything left in the same order. The amounts change. We encumbered $376, but when it was done, our room was a little bit cheaper. Our taxes were a little bit less. Our per diem was a little bit less, and our mileage ended up being much less than what we reconciled at. So when the encumbrance is clearing after the reconciliation is approved, the full encumbrance of this $822 is cleared. And the difference is obviously in travel. If we end up claiming less than what we're actually advanced, the employee then would have a balance sitting out there that they would owe the travel potentially back to the tribe. And now the opposite general ledger entry happens. Encumbrance control is debited, and the credit is then expensed. Boom, our financial report's now clear, and we can move on to the next step. I'd probably say this in anything where we talk about the financial reports, but once we get stuff approved, vouchers, reconciliations, our request, the first thing we should do is run a financial report. Did the encumbrance get posted, or did it clear the way we expected it to before we move on anymore? Further down the road we move, we're just adding more transactions for somebody to have to look at if a problem arises. And if we do have a problem where something didn't clear correctly or something, that's affecting your budget and your ability to spend. So the faster we're on top of this, the easier it is for everybody. So here's the journal entries that happen once we're releasing that travel. 4 different releases, just like we had 4 different creations, 4 different lines of entry on the journal entry to create the encumbrance, but to release it, 4 different things. Look at the post date and the date the document was approved, are completely different. So whatever we date a document for is going to control when this stuff affects our finances, meaning it doesn't matter how long it takes to get approved. If we dated it for July 30th and this thing isn't fully approved until August 13th, 2 weeks later, the date is still going to be July 30th. So whatever we put on our documents for dates controls how everything is going to post. And when it comes to ending or starting new fiscal years, is going to control what our financial reports are going to say too. And then it's a snapshot look at each of those entries, the debits and credits that we're talking about, getting rid of the encumbrance as the reconciliation was approved. Here's the release card for the same thing. And same pattern we're seeing, 4 separate entries, because each of those things are treated differently. Each line is its own standalone entry. And then we see how much on the far right, the amount on the purchase line. This is how much they reconciled with. And this is the amount that got released. So yes, they don't match, they don't have to. It's just that this was done properly, so the full amount was released whenever they were done reconciling. And it'd be the same way if it was a voucher and we're paying. If we had a voucher for $400, but the purchase order was for $1,000, we'd see the same thing here. We'd see $1,000 released with an amount on purchase line of $400. So as long as we're doing it right, we get the good outcome that we're showing here. Now the general ledger report showing it being released. So if we drill into our financial reports, this is what we're going to see. And this is what we'd want to see. So formatting transactions controls how our encumbrances are managed. We got to stay consistent with how we create the document. Always refer back to the original, like in this travel example, those 4 lines better be there. Consistency is vital. So the date on the transactions controls when the activity is going to be posted to Intacct. The date defaults to today's date. So if we're reconciling a travel that should be posted to a different period of time, like when the fiscal year ends, and it's October, or making a payment or closing something out from fiscal year 20, we're going to want to make sure we correct the date to 9/30, because if it's October, it's going to want to date it to whatever date it is in October that you're working on. So prior to submitting your transactions, the date must be verified to prevent potential posting issues, which could result in posting into the future, fiscal year issues, and it can affect our budget and our reports. If we think we've closed September and it's time to file a quarterly report, monitors go through that and do their 425s and send it off. And then after the fact, we realize we paid a FY20 bill that should have been for September, but we kept the November date on it. Not only is that going to be labor intensive to have to fix on journal entry, the monitor's work isn't done by just figuring that part out. They also have to amend their 425 and send it in again. With the dates, we have to be careful because of shortcut keys. If we're creating a request, notice how the date is highlighted because the cursor starts there, not with the vendor. And if we were going to do a document for Rosebud Office Solutions, I type an R. That's a shortcut key to actually give us the last day of the year. And I type an R and the vendor doesn't start typing, so now I get back in there and start looking for our vendor. If we didn't realize what we'd done up here and we go through all this stuff, we're going to submit a request trying to post it into December. And depending on the type of budget you have, you might end up posting something into the future, which will allow you to continue to spend this year because this money's not encumbered on this year's budget. Or, of course, that can be confusing when we're expecting to see something on our reports and why isn't this encumbrance there? So just something to be careful with. The dates are vital to any of these transactions. All the associated documents must be dated to post to the period of time we want the activity to be posted to. Is bottom line on this stuff on the dates. And there's the example below. We have somebody working on something for October 16th. And then the GL posting date was changed to 9/30, so that would post correctly back into FY20. And so that's a type of a thing we want to see from October to November as we're paying the older bills. Besides the date, a thing that can give us a problem with our encumbrances is changing the item ID. We've seen examples of people who create a purchase requisition using one line item and then realizing when it comes time to pay, they didn't like the purchase order or the line item they used, so they want to change it to something else. And to most people going through the approval stuff, that's not really going to be something people are looking at. Monitors are probably looking at your dollar amounts to make sure the documents you've attached support that. For budget purposes, Intacct's already approved the purchase order request. And if you have budget when you submit the voucher, it's going to let that go through. But on the back end, as we've seen going through all those other screens, Intacct's creating these entries for a specific line item. And so whenever we submit this thing for a payment and we've changed the line item, we're now telling Intacct that that original entry doesn't have a match, so it can't be cleared. So we may end up in a situation with encumbrances sitting out there because we wanted to change the account number after we've started this transaction. So if we ever run into a situation like that, we need to close the purchase order and start again, not change the document because we'll affect the accounting of your funds. As we go through, if anyone has questions, you just put them in the chat room, the little chat, and I'll answer them as we go through. So changing the number of line entries, something we see where user creates a document and has multiple lines of entry. And when it's time to pay or to reconcile our stuff, we take a line off. So like in the original example that we had here, we had 4 lines for travel. And now we've decided one of those lines we're not going to include in our reconciliation. If we remove the line, the original encumbrance isn't going to be able to be cleared. And so the accounting will then be a problem. So if the lines aren't included, their encumbrance might not clear, which means your budget will not be reduced, which means you'll have less money to spend until you or another person realizes that that wasn't done correctly. Blanket purchase orders can be used for any situation that benefits the program when it comes to a blanket PO. We do that on utilities, contracts, that kind of stuff. It helps streamline the purchasing process. And so we create one, like in this example here, we put a quantity of 480 and a price of $1. We wanted a $480 purchase order, and then we keep using the quantity as we're paying vouchers, if we're doing multiple vouchers to pay from up to $480, which is a great tool to use. However, our responsibility as program users is to see to it that the full quantity is used and that we keep the formatting the same way. If the full quantity is not converted, the transaction remains open, which means the rest of the encumbrance doesn't go away until you tell it to. When we use a blanket purchase order, we're telling Intacct that we have 480 things on the shelf and we need it to sit open until we take it all down. Intacct doesn't know if you've paid $175 and said you're done. It doesn't know that until you've exhausted that full quantity. So the remaining balance in the quantity field is not going to be utilized. It's the responsibility of the program to ensure the remaining quantity is converted into a closed partial PO. If you do not close or fully convert the quantity field, the amount not converted remains encumbered and could limit your spending. And to go back to this thing, often we open a blanket purchase order, and when it comes time to pay, we'll change the quantity to 1 and the price to $175. That reduces the purchase order by 1, so the quantity would then be $399. So either way, whatever we're doing needs to stay consistent with how we've created it, and then in the end, make sure we've exhausted the full quantity. So that's all easy to say, but how do we find out what we're doing right? How do we find our open purchase orders so we know what to fix or what's sitting out there for us that might have been an issue? So in Intacct, we can use purchasing list views. So if anyone's taken the purchasing list view session I did last month, if I go to purchase order, I have a view created called FY20 Open POs. So typically everyone's on all, but you can click here. If it says all, click on all and find the FY20 Open POs list. And this gives a list of all the open purchase orders, whether they're pending or partially converted. And so for the full tribe, we have 1,200 of those things. And then depending on your access when you're looking at this, you may just see your program, whether it's White Buffalo Calf, SRD, Legislative Affairs, whatever program you're working in, you'll see the stuff you have access to. And if you have multiple people working in your program, you would see all of their activity too, not just yours. But when we go here, we can see a list of stuff that needs to be addressed. So Alma's name's first in alphabetical order, so we get to see her stuff. But we have purchase orders going back to November of 2019 that's waiting for us to do something with. So those would be things I'd be looking at this point. Would a $75 purchase order from November, is that something that should still be open? Or is this a bill we didn't pay? Or do we pay in a different way? Whatever we're doing, we can use this purchase list view to find all the open stuff that's waiting for us to take action. And so we've got under purchase orders, the FY20 open POs. You could go to contracts. There's a view called CSPO open. Here's all our open contracts. So we have one from October for $86 that's been sitting there unpaid or not closed or whatever the issue is. But it's been open this entire fiscal year and no action's been taken. Fortunately, it's just $86, so it's probably not a big problem for your budget. But if this was for a larger amount, or your program who has a smaller budget, you've had something preventing you from spending for this whole fiscal year. And you could do something, use this type of view just to find what work is sitting out there waiting for you. It's a good reminder to see what you've created and what you're waiting on. So this is one way to find our purchase orders. Typically, most people are going to do a financial report through the report center. So if we go to the fiscal year, and we'll do expenses for one funding source view. And we'll look at council for the general account. So now here comes our financial report. So the third column of this report is our encumbrances. And down at the bottom, they have 3 line items with open encumbrances. It's not a lot of information there for us to see, other than the amount that's encumbered for office supplies, for example, $611. If we wanted to know who that was, right at the moment, this report isn't the best thing to find out who that would be or what purchase order that would be. You could do the PO open POs for FY20 and probably get a good answer for that. But in the purchasing list views, we don't see the account numbers or even the funding sources. So some of you that are logged in right now have access to multiple funds. This might not tie to a report you were looking at that. So if you look at the one funding source view reports, all the amounts are in blue, meaning they're hyperlinked. If I click on that 611, it's going to take us to the general ledger report. And it's going to let us start finding out more and more information about what's open. And so we can, fortunately, it looks like they don't do a lot of activity here. So we can see that the 430 crosses out 1408, 1408, 102, 102. This $3,000 washes out with this $3,000. But we have 2 encumbrances, 161 and 450, that don't have matching credits or commitment releases. So we know these are the 2 things that are sitting out there open for us. This report currently doesn't show the vendor. If you don't use this report regularly, this is what it's going to look like for you. And so if I go to customize, the criteria from the financial report is punched in already for us. And down here for dimension values, I can say, I want to see the vendor. So now when we view the report where we run, now we know who the vendors are. So we know that in this case for council, the 2 open POs are from Rosebud Office Solutions. Now we can go back into purchasing and start looking for our POs to Rosebud Office Solutions that would match this, and then take whatever action we need to take. This is from March. But at this point, we've probably been billed if this was something we ended up ordering, or maybe we end up not making an order and we can now close this related purchase order and get the encumbrance off our books. So this is a pretty invaluable way to look further into your encumbrances. If we wanted to know balances on the fiscal reports or the financial reports, we have this one here called Encumbrances by Vendor. So we'll stick with the council one here. And as this runs, this report is going to give us a summary of the encumbrances by vendor for each of our funding sources. So if you ran this and used your program and all checkbooks and ran the report, you get a breakdown by each fund of the open encumbrances for each vendor. So we're using the council's general fund. We don't see the line item number. All we see is, here's your vendor, and this is our total encumbrances. So this may help us identify, so now we can go back to our purchasing application and say, And let's look for all the Rosebud Office Solutions, because now it's not just office supplies, it's another line item. And then these others as well. So great to help us figure that out. There's a couple more reports out there you could use. So we have one called Open POs by Vendor. So when you're at the report center, I like to stay at all reports and all applications because I don't want to limit myself to just financial reports. We all have access to some customized reports. So if I use the search bar and start typing in open, a report called Open POs by Vendor shows up. It's set to always show the fiscal current year to date. You can make that change if you wanted a different period of time by using the drop-down box or typing in specific dates. We need to put in a checkbook. You have to have a program that you're using. And if we wanted a specific vendor, so let's stick with the Rosebud Office Solutions. Now we can see that's what we have entered. We want to see the details. If we were going to print this report, landscape is going to be our best option. That's the sideways paper view. So it won't be as condensed and crunched together like a portrait type. So we've got this information. We click view. So now we've gotten a list of all three things that are making up our balance for encumbrances with Rosebud Office Solutions. See the amount for each one, the dates they were created, and then right here's the PO number for those things that's waiting for us to take action with. So open POs by vendor, great report for looking at the open purchase orders. And then we can just click on the PO itself, the link to that. And so now we'll get taken directly to the purchase order so we can research whatever it is and then make a decision about what needs to happen with it. And so if we're ready to pay, we can go to more actions and start taking whatever activity that we need to do to get this thing going. But we get those PO numbers listed for us. It's easy stuff to do. We don't have to rely on someone else. Hey, monitor, can you help me find out what my encumbrances are? Yeah, you can take care of that. You can print this report, email it to whoever you need to send to. You know, if you're a program director and you want to send it to your admin assistant, why do we have POs unpaid from February and March, or February and April, sorry. You know, get your business taken care of and clear out your encumbrances that's holding up your budget. So we have the open POs by vendor. And then the last report I want to show is called Purchasing Transaction Detail. So it's actually under the purchasing section, not under financial reports, like the open POs. And so this is set to default to the fiscal year. Just like the other report, we're going to tell it what checkbook and program we want to look up. If we want to only look up office supplies, we can do that, or contracts, or utilities, whatever line item you want to look at specifically. That's your chance there. Or if you want to look through the subrecipient accounts, that kind of stuff. So you can specify there. If there's a certain funding source you want to look up, here's our chance to put that in. If I leave it at just the program and checkbook, this would mean any funding source I have access to that falls under this combination is going to show up in the report. So if I have multiple funds and I want to look at all of them instead of specifying one, I'm going to leave funding source ID blank. If council had more than one funding source assigned to it under the general account, and I only want to look up the one, then I should enter the funding source here. So for those of you who have multiple Department of Justice grants, and you have your program in Checkbook 88, if you want to see all of them, then don't put in a funding source. If you want to see one specific one, use the funding source ID. And that's like the same thing with the item ID. Do you want to just look at contracts or a specific line, or do we want to see all of them? So I'm going to leave it blank because I want all of the item IDs to come back. State. If you're familiar with your purchasing document states, we can specify the state of the document we want to see. So we'll look for anything pending. Type. Of all the purchasing transaction types that are available in Intacct, do I want to look at just one type of purchasing document, or do I leave it blank and just use all of them? So I'm going to leave that blank. We can choose a vendor, or we leave it blank for all vendors. And if we're going to print it, probably use landscape. So we're going to look for anything in this fiscal year through today, general account, council, anything pending, any transaction regardless of the type. Okay. And it just so happens that these are all pending purchase orders. Nothing else. All our purchase requisitions have been converted. All our travel documents have been converted. So the only stuff sitting out there waiting for us to take action on are all these purchase orders that we get the numbers to and links to go right to it. We get the amounts, the line item we're using, whoever the vendor is, what we wrote in the memo of our request. So a pretty informative report. This gives us a really good result for whatever we want to look at in our purchasing. It's going to tell us what to look at. So we've had no questions yet. Does anyone listening have any questions? Okay. And this would work for anything we want to look up. If I wanted to just see anything that's been declined, so that list gets much bigger. Whole bunch of declined stuff. So if we were wanting to know why our purchase order to Rosebud Office Solutions, this is water, our order hadn't come in, we can come here and find out, well, darn, it's because we've never placed the order because our request got declined. And then we can start going into the document to figure out who declined it and was there a reason given to us. And you get the same options: print, email, export it to Excel or whatever format you'd like outside of what Intacct makes available to you. All right, so that's the last part I'm going to cover about encumbrances or commitments. So we've seen the things that create our encumbrances, the things that release them, examples of what can cause problems to leave them sitting out there, how we can use the purchasing list views to find our open stuff that we need to fix, or a handful of different reports we can use to find our open POs. If we have no questions, everybody, thank you for your time. And this recording will be available on my website once I have time to go through and make sure everything sounds great.